Hi there, I'm Keith Kintigh, a Forest Conservation and Certification Specialist with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I help coordinate Kirtland's warbler breeding habitat management on Michigan state forest lands and have worked with the Kirtland's warbler for about 20 years. I'm here today to talk to you about Kirtland's warbler conservation after recovery. This is a presentation that was primarily prepared by Dr. Deanne Donner with the Northern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, with the assistance of myself, Phil Huber, with the U.S. Forest Service here on Manistee National Forest, and Dr. Carol Bassetti, California University of Pennsylvania in Pennsylvania. Kirtland's warblers are North America's rarest wood warbler and among the world's rarest birds. They are neotropical migrants, meaning they breed and raise young here in Michigan for about 4 months of the year, May through August generally. Then after a 2-week migration, spend about 8 months in the tropics. They are a songbird, meaning during breeding, males sing as a means of claiming and defending a breeding territory. Kirtland's warblers have a restricted range in both their breeding and wintering grounds. They breed almost exclusively in northern lower Michigan and winter primarily in the Bahamian Islands. In both parts of their range, they use early successional or young forest habitat. Their breeding grounds are expansive, young, dense jack pine stands between 5 and 20 years old, which were historically created by wildfire but are now most often regenerated through plantations. About 5 to 10% of the population also breeds in the UP, Wisconsin, and Ontario. Kirtland's warbler are primarily insectivorous, meaning they eat insects while on the breeding grounds. They generally have 1 clutch per year with up to 4 young and may re-nest if their first nest fails. In the wintering grounds, they use shrub-scrub habitats such as black torch and wild sage shrubs, often found along coastlines, in goat farms, and in power line right-of-ways. They are primarily fruit eaters or frugivorous on the wintering grounds. You can see in the pictures here, and this top picture is an example of the young jack pine forest where Kirtland's warbler breed. And here in the bottom picture you can see the shrub habitats in the Bahamas that where they winter. You can see with the cruise ship in the background there. This map shows the highest concentration of breeding areas in the northern lower peninsula, and you can see the Bahamian Islands here in orange to show you where the winter habitat is. Well, one of the original 75 species listed as federally endangered in 1967, Kirtland's warblers are now considered recovered and stable, thanks in large part to over 40 years of management by state and federal agencies and nonprofit organizations. Since 2001, breeding populations have exceeded the recovery goal of 1,000 breeding pairs identified in the recovery plan for Kirtland's warbler. The population was at a low of 167 pairs in 1987, and now, 30 years later, exceeds 2,000 pairs, which is still exceedingly small compared to most other North American birds. It was removed from federal listing under the Endangered Species Act in November of 2019. It represents the first conservation-reliant species to be removed from listing under the Endangered Species Act, meaning it's the first endangered species to be removed that requires active and ongoing coordinated management to sustain its recovery. Kirtland's warbler has recovered because of consistent applied conservation strategies, including management and annual creation of new breeding habitat on dedicated public lands, the reduction of brown-headed cowbird nest parasitism through cowbird population control, monitoring of populations to evaluate responses to management practices, conducting of active research, which has led to continued learning and adaptation, and lastly, the raising of public awareness through information and education, including annual Kirtland's Warbler tours, this Kirtland's Warbler Festival, and an annual calendar contest. So what is the greatest threat to the species post-delisting? It's the loss of these recovery strategies and continued management due to reduced funding and priorities. What happens to a conservation-reliant species when you remove the urgency and funding of the Endangered Species Act? I'd like to spend the rest of the talk explaining some of these challenges to you, focusing on the first three of the previously mentioned strategies: managing breeding habitat, managing cowbirds, and monitoring, and explain how agencies and partners are adapting to these challenges. The first challenge we face is continuing to sustain management of breeding habitat. Kirtland's warbler breeding habitat is managed within 170,000 acres of dedicated state and federal lands in the northern Lower Peninsula. In addition, about 30,000 acres of federal land in the eastern Upper Peninsula are managed for the benefit of Kirtland's warbler. About 3,000 acres of new habitat are created annually on these lands, with the goal of maintaining about 30,000 acres of suitable habitat at any one time. Habitat projects are also planned in Wisconsin and Ontario. Kirtland's warbler prefer expansive, young jack pine thickets with interspersed openings for nesting. Optimal habitat will be contained in stands at least 300 acres in size, with stem densities of at least 1,000 trees per acre, with about 25% of the area in grassland openings. These are very dense stands, and trees are often suppressed as they grow. While this is good habitat, it's often bad for timber development, but more on that in a bit. Habitat is created by first harvesting large blocks of mature and immature jack pine through commercial timber sales, generally about 5,000 acres in size. Larger blocks are preferred as Kirtland's warbler occupies these blocks in higher densities and for longer periods of time, and rarely nest in areas less than 100 acres in size. After harvest, sites are prepared for planting, most often by creating furrows through trenching, in which seedlings are planted. The primary purpose of trenching is to expose mineral soil and improve survival of the trees that are planted. 1- and 2-year-old jack pine seedlings are typically hand planted at these high densities in an opposing wave pattern with the use of contract migrant planting crews. Kirtland's warbler tend to nest at the edges of the opening created by this pattern. Planted areas become breeding habitat in about 5 years, and areas will be used by Kirtland's warbler for about 10 years. You can see an example of the opposing wave pattern in this aerial photo here, where there are 10 to 12 rows of furrows going one way, and then a mirror image, 10 to 12 rows of furrows going the other way. And that leads to these diamond-shaped openings being created that won't have trees in them. They'll remain grasslands. Land management agencies like the Department of Natural Resources are presented with a number of challenges creating Kirtland's warbler habitat into the future. These challenges include the high cost of habitat creation, the challenge of having enough mature jack pine to harvest, and the simplification of the jack pine ecosystem through plantation management. Finally, the low commercial value of mature plantation jack pine. Establishing habitat is expensive. Agencies are planting about 3 million purchased or grown seedlings per year across 3,000 acres. Preparing sites for planting requires the use of heavy equipment, which requires specialized contracting or maintenance and personnel for agency equipment. Kirtland's warbler lands are harsh environments, and the success of planting efforts can be unpredictable. Replants and fill-in planting is often needed, and there have been years, though they're rare, where 100% of planted seedlings failed because of drought or unusually early springs. Lands on which Kirtland's warbler habitat is created can also support other rare species. Often Kirtland's warbler plantations are not beneficial for these other rare species. In recent years, managers have begun modifying plantation configurations to provide accommodations for these other species. which often reduces benefits to Kirtland's warbler. And you can see some examples of these rare species pictured here, including the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, Allegheny plum, Hill's thistle, this grasshopper called the secretive locust, and a rare grass called rough fescue. Older jack pine generally has more timber value, yet often younger jack pine stands must be harvested to meet habitat creation goals. What's pictured here is an example on federal lands of the Mac Lake fire that regenerated about 24,000 acres of suitable habitat, and is one of the reasons for the population boom in Kirtland's warbler that occurred in the late 1980s. However, the Mac Lake burn is now 40 years old. These are dense stands that have grown slow, and they really have no value, commercial value, for management agencies. An important question is how to manage to have more lands in older age groups with higher timber value while recognizing the trade-off of lower density of Kirtland's for Kirtland's warbler. So you can see here what's pictured is an age class distribution for the Mac Lake area. These are 10-year age classes, so this is the number of acres of stands in these particular age classes. So you can see this 0 to 19 is where the Kirtland's warblers are currently nesting. And to create that habitat, we need 50 to 60-year-old or older jack pine to commercially harvest to open the land. And you can see that because of the Mac Lake burn, there are a lot of acres in this 30 to 39-year-old age class. There's not much here that's available to commercially harvest for the next cohort of young habitat, thus presenting challenges for managers. Agencies have committed to confronting these challenges through experimentation. In our current approach, about 75% of habitat management is for traditional habitat creation, meaning the opposing wave pattern that was discussed earlier, while about 25% of land will be used for experimental management. To date, experiments have included promoting natural regeneration to lower costs and improve site diversity, creating plantations at lower jack pine density to give trees more room to grow while still supporting Kirtland's warbler nesting, and also interplanting of red pine within jack pine, and as red pine is a tree with more commercial value than jack pine. The second major challenge we face as managers is related to the management of brown-headed cowbird. Cowbirds are a species of the Great Plains that expanded into Michigan following forest clearing and development in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Cowbirds do not incubate and raise their own young. Instead, they trick other birds into this chore by replacing that bird's eggs with a cowbird egg. Many bird species are adapted to deal with cowbirds, but Kirtland's warbler is not. It will unwittingly raise a cowbird chick as its own, all the while reducing its own clutch. Controlling cowbirds is expensive and labor-intensive. Since 1972, cowbirds have been managed through the use of live decoy traps. You can see an example of one here. Historically, 50 to 60 traps were managed annually, resulting in the removal of about 3,000 cowbirds per year for Kirtland's warbler breeding habitat. Over the last 10 years, however, cowbird populations have declined significantly across the Great Lakes region. In 2015, trapping began to be reduced and was completely suspended in 2018. Current nest parasitism rates on Kirtland's warbler nests are less than 1%. This is based on monitoring efforts that are being conducted by the Smithsonian. Efforts are currently focused on understanding the levels at which we may need to reinstate control measures should cowbirds begin to increase again in the future. The third challenge facing managers relates to monitoring. From 1971 to 2013, agencies and volunteers conducted an annual census to count the total number of singing Kirtland's warblers range-wide. A total population count is very unusual in conservation. Most populations are estimated through sampling and statistics. As the Kirtland's warbler population has increased, this effort has become more difficult, labor-intensive, and costly. Efforts are currently focused on developing methods to obtain a statistical estimate of the population, and for the first time since 2015, a complete census will be conducted this year, 2021. In addition, understanding the benefits of experimental habitat work will require intensive monitoring of Kirtland's warbler response. As a condition of federal delisting, agencies have committed to a 12-year post-delisting monitoring plan, which defines monitoring activities and lower thresholds at which discussions would begin for potential relisting. In addition to monitoring the population and monitoring cowbirds through the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, agencies and partners will monitor other activities and thresholds, including those listed here under breeding habitat and within the full life cycle. Well, I hope you can see that delisting doesn't mean that our work is done. Kirtland's Warbler Conservation is much more than the things I've discussed here. There are a number of efforts focused on conservation in the Bahamas, as well as efforts on improving education for Kirtland's Warbler. To learn more, check out these sites, kwconservation.org and kirtlandswarbler.org. Well, I thank you for your time and attention. I'd like to specifically thank Mike Petrucia and the planning committee for the Kirtland's Warbler Festival for the invitation to speak to you today. I understand that Mike will be collecting questions, and for any of those questions that he's not able to answer, and he is very knowledgeable on matters of Kirtland's Warbler conservation, but for any of those questions he's not able to answer, I understand that they'll be forwarded to me, and I'll do my best to get responses to you. So thanks again.